Hey everyone, welcome back to our Followers podcast with myself, John, and Shane. Today we're going to have a chat around fueling for sport, fueling for gym sessions, little bits around hydration ahead of these, as well as what foods to be looking for and what strategies to try and implement in the lead up to exercise and try to make them a little bit more digestible for you. So without further ado, we'll jump into today. Do you want to say hi, guys, before we get going, or we just jump on in?
I'll just jump straight in.
Straight in. Let's go. So over the years, it takes a little bit of time and focus in developing your strategies. So from our perspective, we try to coach guys into better practices, guys and girls into better practices in the lead up to sporting performance or training. And it's incredibly important to remember your diet, your hydration, and including this in your lead up to training, especially if you take part in team sports. A lot of the time fueling can be focused in on game day, but if it's not something that you've practiced over and over again, that trying to implement it on a game day or on a lead up to a game day, you're kind of you may be a little bit blind going into it. So it's always a good, I suppose, starting point for me with people is to get people to take a look at how they approach their training sessions, what decisions they make around hydration, what decisions they make around food in that day in particular, but even to the night before, and I suppose with training, the complications that come around that is that you may have maybe a strength-based training on one night. The next night, if you're playing Gaelic football or rugby or something like that, you may have a field-based training the following night, so you're trying to recover, like we discussed last week, efficiently, but then trying to refuel again for the next night. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't implement some strategies around meals, meal timing, and the likes. So how have you guys approached building in those kind of practices with teams or individual athletes, or just your everyday gym goer or anything like that? Is there any standouts there for you guys?
The two main things I think that'll influence how I'm guiding players or athletes I'm working with will be, first of all, what time of day is the session, the game they're about to go into, and how you change around your eating for that. And then the next one will be just making sure there's enough fuel on board from far enough out. So say if there's something at 7 o'clock in the evening time, you might need to start at 7 o'clock or even earlier the day before. If they have something at 11 o'clock in the morning, you probably need to spend the full day beforehand getting ready for that. And then adjusting it based on what the athlete themselves likes to eat themselves. And that can even be based on, like, if they have kind of preconceptions around what is a breakfast food, make sure that they're eating a breakfast food that's high in carbohydrate, which isn't an issue. Most traditional breakfast foods tend to be very high. And if it's the evening time, then how they can get their good carbohydrate stuff in throughout the day, as opposed to just loading it on for the meal right beforehand. The other little bit is how nervous players may tend to get before a game, and that can really put them off eating a decent amount of food. So you may need to look at loading up a bit earlier so that nerves haven't affected them, but also maybe trying to get it on through liquid calories, because they can be just easier to get on board as opposed to more solid foods that might be harder to digest if they've a stomach that's hopping around the place with nerves and isn't really able to deal with all the food they should be digesting. What about yourself, Shane?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with your points. And the other thing that I usually try to do is I make sure to educate the players around like why we're doing this, because a lot of the time, a lot of people who think they're eating well will immediately think you have to eat almost in a calorie deficit to be eating well or to be paying attention to what you eat. You're going to gear towards weight loss as the goal, whereas that's not the case, especially in a performance sport. You have to educate them that this is the fuel that you're putting into your body. So if you don't have enough fuel, you won't be able to perform as well. You won't have that energy to continue throughout the day. So it's just kind of providing a bit of education around it. So then at least they know a little bit about what they're doing, rather than just saying eat this, this, and this, and not giving them a reason why, or telling them why they're doing this.
That's actually a great point, Shane, that I've come across. Now, just as you mentioned it there was a lot of experiences I've had with athletes over the past few years that kind of flashed across me there. That calorie deficit, that needing to maintain, say, a body composition that may be perceived to be optimal for sport, that when it comes to fueling for your sport, especially for performance, with training, naturally enough, you can build in practices around different types of foods and different types of meals. But when it comes to actually fueling for the performance, so if it's a marathon, or if it's a Gaelic football game, or if it's a rugby game, whatever it may be, that often athletes still take the approach of I have to be a little bit more limited in quantity and portion sizes than we would consider to be efficacious or optimal for them. And
Damien's just topped out on us there. He must have bad internet down in Cork or Kerry, wherever he's based at the minute.
Okay, so sorry for the old technical glitch there. So it just on your point, Shane, there on the amount of athletes that do tend to continue with, say, the idea of a calorie deficit, or to say keep their body composition goals in mind, or perceived body composition targets that might be considered optimal for the sport or activity that they are competing in, that this is often something that's kept in mind when it comes to fueling for performance. And it shouldn't be, really, because if you want to fuel to perform at your optimal levels, at your full capacity, eating in a manner that's going to maintain a calorie deficit is quite likely going to result in you being under-fueled going into performance. So while building strategies around the foods that you do choose, whether depending on what time of day you do have to perform, like you mentioned, John, that if your game or sport happens to take place at, say, early in the morning versus late in the evening, you're trying to fuel, get used to eating in a manner that would allow you to fuel for that. But while the foods are important, it is incredibly important to remember that you do need to get much higher levels of carbohydrate, especially for those glycolytic type sports. You do need to ensure that you're getting in much higher levels of that in the 36 hours leading into your performance. So that's something to keep in mind, that does often, I suppose, crop up with athletes. I suppose I've seen it with in rugby athletes and in Gaelic football athletes. I've seen it quite a lot in those, but it is something that does tend to crop up in conversation, that I do bring my carbohydrate to earlier in the day when I go to perform, but I often feel that towards the end of games that I'm not, I don't really have the energies to finish out games. And that often does come down to, just from my experience with athletes, with different players, is that they're keeping their normal maybe body composition goals in mind when trying to perform. So I do think that's a great point that is worth me rambling for a few minutes on, just how big of I suppose a mistake this can be, and how detrimental it can be to your overall performance across, whether whatever your sport is, that you do run out of, or you do run low on your glycolytic stores, which you build up from your carbohydrate intake. So it's important to ensure that enough of that is getting in.
Yeah, I think it's especially prevalent kind of around pre-season, because I think in a lot of people's minds, they see pre-season and they think body composition, or this is a chance to lose some of that weight that I put on in the off-season. And it is in a way, but the main focus should be energy system development for pre-season. So when you should be increasing your carbohydrates, make sure you have the fuel to push yourself on and develop that energy system. A lot of athletes are reducing their carbohydrate intake because they want to improve their body composition. whereas that's not looking for the overall goal for performance. They're just thinking about it wrong. So just a little education, even it doesn't have to be a huge amount, it's just kind of educating them a bit more on the fact that food is used for fuel coming through sports.
Just when you said there, carbohydrate is the main fuel for glycolytic type stuff. What do you mean by that, Damien? What is glycolytic type stuff?
So your intermittent sprint sports, your long, your maybe athletic endeavors like your running, maybe your middle distance running, your 5-10Ks, right up to your marathon running, you do need to have quite a significant glycolytic carbohydrate storage in your body there. So, and again, this is something you do train in over time. So if you're looking to optimally perform, you need to train to allow that to happen. So that's one side of it. However, your strength sports do still demand your glycolytic stores as well, and this is often an area that does get overlooked a little too. In some sectors where people do tend to cut carbohydrates, whether it be for body composition or whatnot, but it has in a number of, in my experience, in a number of athletes, this been a common practice to reduce carbohydrates if they need to reach a weight target, and then kind of thinking, well, sure, I only have to perform across individual reps, say for powerlifting, so I don't necessarily need carbohydrate. However, carbohydrate is still a fuel. It's a fast acting explosive fuel source. So having insufficient levels or too low levels in your body from obviously input from your diet, that this can have a detrimental effect on those type of sports as well. Where it can be detrimental for your field sports like your Gaelic football, hurling, rugby, soccer, these kind of things, is that you may have sufficient levels to get through, say, the first half and kind of push yourself there. But then as you get into the second half, even with a little bit of top up at halftime, you may just not have sufficient levels to finish out the second half of your game. So what happens is your performance dips, and with that, your ability to focus on the task at hand, to make decisions on, say, if we take Gaelic football, it could be simple as misreading a run, or it could be, you know, putting a pass off. It could be something very slight that you might think is, oh, I need to work harder at my skills, whereas in actual fact it could be directly linked to just a dip in fuel source. So your focus and ability to perform the task that you would normally perform well, it can drop off. So they would be the big areas that it would kind of, that they're the areas across, you know, basically your more intermittent type sprint or long distance sport things where it can be an issue, but it can also be an issue in strength sports and single rep kind of performance things as well.
I think that's a good point that Damo brings up about decision making, because it's kind of, everyone knows the carbohydrates the fuel for the body, but it's kind of overlooked that they're also the fuel for the brain. So it's that kind of decision making and that focus. They're very important late on in the game, that if you haven't fueled yourself sufficiently, that's when errors are going to creep in. And that's kind of a lot of goals, a lot of mistakes happen in those last 20 minutes of a game. A lot of that can come down to people not sufficiently fueling themselves. And again, for strength sports, like, it's very hard to lift 200-300 kilos if you are focused, let alone if you're not focused or your kind of mind is off a bit. So it's an important point to remember that you're not just fueling your body, you're fueling your brain and your mental power and focus as well.
That's good there where you mentioned, Damien, about Gaelic football and glass amounts of a game and fuel like that. So a couple of articles came out last week, a couple of studies led by the group in Tala, who looked at carbohydrate fuel and just calorie requirements in general of Gaelic footballers. So they found an awful lot of Gaelic footballers, particularly on periods of hard training, were burning upwards of 4,000 calories a day, which is quite a lot. So to get in enough fuel in general is going to lead to a lot of food just being eaten, and the majority of that is going to come from carbohydrate because it's generally the easiest to get more of. So they found that while the calorie output wasn't really being met, a lot of players were eating 2,800 up to 3,500. That once they started, not really force feeding, but encouraging them to eat that bit more, the majority of which was from carbohydrate. So they started looking at performance. Now, how do you measure performance in Gaelic football? It's obviously difficult because there's so many different factors to be looked at. But when they got players to eat the right amount, particularly through carbohydrate, they found that those who were eating upwards of the higher end of the recommendations were just doing an awful lot more running, and particularly high speed running. And most of that came at the last 20 minutes of a game, which is like from playing field sports. That's when an awful lot of the game winning work is done, where you can see one team fatigue, one team make more mistakes, as you've mentioned there, due to whether it be mental fatigue or just poor decision making. But because it's one of the closest things we can get to measuring performance, or it's a metric we can use, they found that there was an awful lot more high speed running at the last 20 minutes of a game and those who ate more, and particularly when that came from extra carbohydrate.
That's very interesting, and I think that is that really covers what we're seeing practically with athletes, is that those athletes that tend to, I suppose, turn up on big days are often the ones who have, fuel themselves efficiently, and they're used to doing it. They didn't just, fuel themselves for that event. And a lot of people will look at, I suppose it is common to look at the training, and he trains harder, he gets out extra days in the week or whatever, but a lot of it is that simple controllable thing of fueling efficiently, and it does tend to be an overlooked factor when for a lot of people. So like that, I think that really, that those studies, that research, it does line up with what I've certainly witnessed in my experience with Gaelic footballers, certainly, but it does. I have seen it in individual athletes as well as rugby athletes as well.
If we're to break this down then into actual the getting of the fuel into the body, what are some typical high carbohydrate foods? What are some options we might put out there for players? What have we used ourselves? Stuff like that. Shane, just back to your bodybuilding days, did you have a go-to pre-training fueling up, or say if you were training the evening time, what does your day look like leading up to one of your bigger sessions?
So usually I'm kind of fairly traditional in food sources. So I usually go for oats as my main carbohydrate source. So usually a couple of hours before I go train, I'd have oats and protein, just so I know then I'm going to have a strong carbohydrate presence. So again, it doesn't hugely bother me eating very close to training sessions. So 1 to 2 hours is usually fine. Like I don't feel that impedes my performance, and it doesn't, I quite like it that way. Whereas I know other people are very much, they don't like eating close to training. So it's very much kind of a personal decision, but it's very important that your last meal before your training session, regardless of what time frame suits you, should have a very solid carbohydrate source coming through. It's also kind of, especially for game days, it feels a bit weird to say because you're almost breaking like the standard traditional rules where you're trying to avoid things like fiber or things like vegetables that are not empty calories but very low calories and very high volume that's going to sit in your stomach. So you're trying to get kind of more fast acting, high GI type foods. So especially a lot of people seem surprised when you're talking to teams and match day pre-game meal is kind of pancakes or something like that, pancakes and syrup. Whereas like it's a fantastic pre-game meal. But again, if you were to talk to someone in general terms saying like what would be a healthy breakfast, they're like pancakes and syrup. And they're like, right, well you're taking this the wrong way. So it's important to keep it in context. But again, it's always like simpler carbohydrates are kind of always better. But I suppose it's always going to be different. Whereas if you're training 4 times a week, you shouldn't really be having pancakes with syrup before training 4 times a week. Whereas if it's a match one day where you know, right, that's going to be my main exertion, that's where I'm focusing all my attention, my performance really matters here, then it's a little bit different because you can gear everything towards that one day. Whereas if you can't gear everything towards every second day, if that makes sense.
And do you eat much extra earlier in the day? Say or even if it's with a team, you're working with a team and you have a game that evening, are you encouraging them to start eating extra breakfast time, lunch time, right up along, or are their main fuel sources coming from the pre-game meal?
Definitely. No, they're definitely going to keep it. I suppose it depends on how much time you have before the game, but usually you want them to get as much fuel as they can in before the game. So if that means spreading it out over 3-4 meals, if it's an evening match, that's great. It just gives us more room to work with. And you can also kind of, per athlete, you'll gauge how you're feeling. So if you eat a lot of carbohydrates early in the day and you feel a bit bloated, you'll know, okay, I can ease off. I know I've eaten enough. Whereas if you kind of try and get as much carbohydrates in say an hour before the game, then you're going to feel bloated and heavy going into the game. So if the more time you have beforehand, the better. But again, obviously you don't choose your own kickoff time. So it's very much depending on the sport and what you have available to you.
And do you find much variance in what athletes prefer to eat? Like, would you try and have options there for the players? Is like, if you're feeding the team beforehand, is that possible? Or if you're giving options to players, suggested stuff to eat, how many options would you give based on players' own preferences?
It's definitely, options they're hugely important, because if you have someone, say, for example, if somebody hates oats and that's the only option there, they're more than likely going to go without eating anything over eating something that they just detest. They're not going to force feed themselves, especially on the day of a game. And a lot of players have different superstitious things, like there's meals they've eaten the whole time. And I try not to dabble with that too much, especially match day things, because superstitions on match day, they can have a much bigger effect on the player mentally than we could ever have from a performance nutrition point of view. So if I have somebody going out and they're not confident in themselves because they didn't have their pre-game meal, or they didn't do whatever, throw their boot over their left shoulder before going out on the pitch, it's going to make a huge difference. And they're not going to feel comfortable in themselves. They're not going to play well. Then they're going to see, oh, it must have been that. And then if I keep forcing them to do something they don't want to do, they're just going to feel like, whereas I prefer to tell players things to avoid. So if they're doing something very wrong, or say if they're not drinking water in the 2 days beforehand, I tell them to include in that. So it's kind of, you're looking for the least amount of change you can make to the player's pre-game ritual that'll make the biggest effect.
And Damien, from working with teams and probably liaising with hotels or restaurants and stuff beforehand, how do you go about working with those to make sure there's a few options there for different players? And is that even possible? How receptive are places to that?
So I suppose, look, when you go in first with a team, it's important to not just go in and go, right, guys, here's literally the menu that we're going with. And it takes a little bit of time to get to know the team you're dealing with, to get to know the athletes a little bit. And then you start to pool together some of the common denominator meals that they like to go for. So what I do with, I suppose with Meath, mostly the rugby seems to be a little bit different in that regard, but with Gaelic football there, and the Meath lads, it's what I'll do is I'll get a menu out to them of meals that they commonly go for, and I'll give them 3 options that I'll have discussed with the hotel, and basically I'll get a list then back from that, and then the hotel knows exactly how many they're going for, how many lads are having one thing, how many lads are having pancakes there if it's in the morning, how many lads are going for a bowl of porridge, or anything like that. So yeah, I try to get guys to that point where they're not just making the decision on the morning. They're not looking at a whole spread in front of them and going like, well, that looks good, so I'm going to go for that. Because with performance, we're looking to build on previous performances. So like, we don't need moving targets or moving goalposts there with that. So it's important for guys to kind of to know what they're going to do, so they know like 2 or 3 days out, and that kind of helps with things like, guys who might be a little bit superstitious in their approach to game days and stuff like that. That it means that there's less moving parts there on the day of the game. So that's normally how I do it. So I probably liaise with a hotel or venue for food probably a month in advance of the game, give them my options, and obviously enough they can kind of cater for pretty much anything, but I generally try to give them maybe 4 or 5, and if they're kind of like, oh, this might be a little bit awkward to do at that time of day, then I might kind of look to remove that, and try to focus in on what they can get out in the numbers that we will need them out, and then I'll send that out to the team the week of the game and go, hey guys, just looking for this. So lads will just write their name down underneath whatever it is that they're going to go for, and then I'll just ensure that the hotel has 2 or 3 of each option extra available, just for any guy who might not feel great. Could be nerves, could be whatever it is, and they kind of want to switch last minute. So that's how I would approach that. But I do kind of tend to leave game day eating within the guidelines of what we were kind of saying to start, trying to help guys to focus in on better strategies, and trying to build in better practices. I do try to get guys to focus on, right, while you've been practicing these things all along, that your game day eating, especially for Gaelic football and rugby, two sports like that, I try to get them to start 36 hours prior to the game. That's where fueling starts for me with them. And similar for maybe your middle distance running, that kind of fueling starts roughly about 36 hours out, and you're just trying to increase your carbohydrate at each meal in the lead up to that, so that when you get to that game day, so because like you mentioned, Shane, that you don't have control over what time the game is at, right? In rugby, all games tend to be, in club rugby anyway, all games tend to be 2 or 2:30 on a Saturday. So you can set your watch to that pretty easy. But for your Gaelic sports, Gaelic games, you could be playing on a Saturday evening, or you could be playing on a Sunday morning. Some clubs are playing midweek at the moment, and they're following up with the next round at the weekend. So trying to fuel accordingly is very tough, and trying to build a routine around that is very tough. So that's where it's important to look at your day and a half, 2 days leading into the day of a performance, as you're fueling up, as your carbohydrate storage focus. So then when it does get to the day of the game, if there's something like nerves kick in and you find you're not able to eat as much, you find that the foods that you kind of planned on eating, you just don't really have an appetite for, or whatever it might be, that you've still fueled yourself up in the 2 days leading into it, where the nerves weren't there to kick in. And I do think that is an area, especially I suppose in club football, from our own research that we carried out a few years ago, John, on hurling and Gaelic football club and county athletes. That was one of the things that popped up for me, was how little people used to focus in on game day eating being the day and a half, 2 days leading into it. It was very much the day of the game, and that just leaves a whole host of issues that could potentially arise. So yeah, that's kind of how I look at it. And obviously your hydration is huge in that time as well, and you're trying to build in these practices. But just from a carbohydrate loading perspective, I do try to look at, like the pre-game meal, which everyone seems to really focus in on, is kind of more, it's just an additional top up to what you've done in the previous 2 days. So that when you get to that meal, if for whatever reason, as I said, you've got moving parts, it might be a league game, which you're kind of like, oh yeah, sure, this is grand. Or it could be a county final. You're going to approach both of those games mentally completely different, because one of them, you're going to be going into it possibly nervous, maybe a little bit more cutthroat. You might not be thinking about your food in the 2-3 hours before a game. You might be really, really focused. So you don't want to kind of risk, focusing on or depending on that meal is what I'd be going with there. So that's kind of a general overview of the guidelines I do give.
So some of the easy steps we can use to start increasing carbohydrate in the 36 hours out, it doesn't need to be anything drastic. It doesn't need to be, okay, I need to go to the shop and buy all these extra carbohydrates. Some of the small steps we can take are, if I have beef and spuds for dinner, I've a match at 3 o'clock Sunday, and Saturday evening have beef and spuds for dinner, and whether I cook it myself or someone else does, I just go, instead of having 2 spuds of that, I might have 4. If I'm having sandwiches for lunch the day before, instead of having 2 slices of bread, I might up it to 3. When I'm having breakfast, if I weigh my porridge and I have normally 80 grams, I might have 100. If I put in a half a glass of porridge usually, or a glass of porridge, I might have 3/4 or a full one now. So it's just some very small steps to get in that extra carbohydrate. If you tend to suffer from nerves, I would probably focus on getting the extra carbohydrate the day before, because it can be hard to digest the next day. Other simple ways are, generally, I would not recommend orange juice or juices in general to anyone, but day of a game, it's a great way to get in predominantly carbohydrate without any big worry on digestion. You don't notice yourself eating it, anything like that. Smoothies can be a help there as well. Sometimes if we have a big game and I know I'm going to be a bit nervous coming up to it, I'll actually go to the shop and get some kind of sugary cereal and empty 3 bowls of that spread across the day, because I know it doesn't really affect me. It's something nice to look forward to throughout the day as well. It breaks up the day, and it's going to load up that carbohydrate in your system there as well. That's another, I find, easy win to get in that extra carbohydrate if you're concerned about nerves, if you're not sure how to add it to the rest of your meals. And particularly coming up to game time, you're looking to, as Jane said earlier, reduce the fibre. So there's no issue with having your whiter foods, your sugary foods are probably going to be of more benefit than the more traditional high fibre, low GI stuff that we're normally told to eat for our everyday diet. It does change for when we're focused on higher performance.
Another thing that Damon kind of briefly touched on it there when he was saying, if you do suffer with nerves and stuff like that, it's important for everybody, but especially if you have nerves or things coming up to a game. If you trial these nutritional strategies in challenge games or in less important games, you'll have that confidence then coming into a big game. You almost do it on autopilot, and then you know that works. So you have confidence in that strategy and that preparation method. And it means then you're more confident coming through, and hopefully that puts the nerves at bay a little bit, especially around food. Whereas the last thing you want is introducing something new on a match day. And like textbook, it could be perfect. You could get it from the nutritionist or the team nutritionist, but something mightn't agree with you. Or even like worst case scenario, you could be allergic to something you didn't realize. So it's so important to trial these, whether it's training or a challenge game, just make sure you know they're going to work, or at the very least that they're not going to negatively impact your performance or your health.
That's a fantastic point as well. And you can almost take from that point, I suppose supplements tend to be something that are very fancy, and this big shiny thing. I've heard from whoever, and it is often down the grapevine, or I've seen this online, I've read this or whatever, and like that this supplement will give me a benefit. And while I'm definitely not, again, opening this week up into supplements conversation, but it's that game day, that fueling time, it's not a time for implementing anything new. If you've never practiced something before, whether it be challenge games or training sessions, the game day is not a day for trying something new. And that could be down to something as simple as, like you mentioned there, Murph, you mentioned smoothies. So if you're not used to having a smoothie before a game, and then you're like, oh, I might try it today, and you could end up with that running through you. So it's important to, that's probably the most polite way I can put it, but it does happen, and because your body isn't used to it, it isn't used to it on game day, and it's just not a day for. That's the one thing when it comes to game day eating, that sticking to what is more important and can have more of a positive effect than trying out something that is shown in research to be optimal. If you haven't tried it before the game day, if it isn't something you've experienced, if it isn't something you've practiced, don't do it. And that could be as simple as increasing a caffeine intake pre-game. It could be something like you're, as I said, having a smoothie pre-game when you're not used to having it. You don't want to bring about any kind of issues from trying something new that you haven't practiced before. So I that's something that I am often blue in the face saying to guys. They'll come up to you in the dressing room in the hour and a half before a game, before throwing in a game, and that you're like, hey, can I try this? And you're like, no. Just more often than not, you're just like, that won't benefit you. But I do try to swing it back in. It might be something, again, like the jellies that we might have available on the table, which often does seem to confuse people when they get a look at the dressing room. They're like, wait, there's a lot of jellies and sugars and sugary drinks inside here, and you're like, yeah, well, this is performance. But it's so it's just that's a big thing that I do see with athletes. In both of my areas, in rugby and Gaelic football, that it's possible for guys to kind of get a little bit sidetracked with, oh, I've heard this is good, can I try this? And it's just game days. I'm like, they're the one day that you do not want to try something new.
Just two things to touch on before we start to wrap up. The first one would be that when we are working with, say, as nutritionists, working with a group, one thing I found very useful for in that last meal or even the second last meal is to try and set it up. Excuse me, when you're working with wherever you're getting the food from, is to have some element of not quite self-service, but where the players have a little bit of selection in their portion size, because some players like to eat much further out and only a small bit coming up to game time, and others would be the opposite. They could eat a massive feed an hour before a game and not be worried that allow the players where possible to choose their own portion size. So if you're having soup and sandwiches before a game, have the sandwiches out on the table so that the players can pick whether it be 2 or 6 how much they want to eat. If they're having the traditional chicken and pasta, where they can scoop that onto the plate themselves, or they can ask the caterer to, can I have an extra scoop there? No, half is plenty for me, with spuds, whatever it is that way. That's something I found really useful, just because players, how much they eat coming up to a game based on times will vary massively. Plus, some players will be quite aware based on the goalkeeper will hopefully be copped on enough to that I don't need 6 slices of bread before a game. Whereas you're hoping your midfielder will be thinking, I need to eat quite a bit today. I'm going to be covering an awful lot of ground. Just last point then, bringing it back to people who are just going for a traditional gym session, a normal training session, what are maybe 2 to 3 options we could suggest to people to have that hour and a half beforehand that tends to be okay in the stomach, but is still decent carbohydrate-wise?
Well, I suppose we do have the oat king here with us today, so I suppose Shane, this is definitely
thanks to Flavins for sponsoring the show.
Works every time.
I suppose there's 2 ends of this. So you have your traditional evening gym goer, where you go into any big kind of gym outlet, they're thronged from 4:30 in the evening to about 8:30 there. So that's where a lot of people are. However, there's different strategies then for people who train at 6 or 6:30 in the morning. That way they try to get in their sessions before work. So we might just separate the 2 a little bit and focus on, because they're going to involve some different strategies. Because I suppose I something I do with individual private clients that I have is that they will try to get up an hour before a gym session in the morning just to eat and have some food digested. That knock on their sleep could be more could be more detrimental than they think. So I tend to approach fueling for an early morning gym session the night before, as opposed to, and then just maybe focusing in on maybe getting water on board in the morning prior to training, maybe getting some electrolytes in. There could be even just something as small as snacking on a few berries or something like that, and drinking some water could be a fantastic approach there for your morning. So you're not, I suppose, putting yourself into big digestion, going into or digesting a large meal or getting up extra early to eat. But yeah, so that would be the only thing I'd like to touch on there with that. Have you any thoughts on that, Shane? I suppose you've definitely had the more, or probably the most experience of the 3 of us with different gym training times and that, with becoming the biggest man I know.
Yes. Oh, first of all, I'm quite happy with that. I'd like that to be a running title. Technically, coming through, I think you're dead right there. So mainly the last meal before they go to bed, if they're training super early in the morning, is going to be most important. So if you think about it, if they're coming into that early morning training session with a full glycogen reserve, they're not going to need a huge meal before they go in. So I would like them to have something small, again, as you said, kind of berries or even my waddy in their water, just so they have a little bit of sugar to kind of get them that initial kick going through, and then it can take into the glycogen. The only thing to remember there is to make sure that they have a meal after they train. So I've had clients in the past who will kind of just go, and they might go to 1 or 2 in the day and just not eat anything, because either it's a super busy day from there, or they literally had the time they were in the gym, then it has to go straight to the office and it's eating through. So again, if you are in that position, you've utilized your glycogen store then. So you've had that glycogen from the night before, it's gone after that session, or very depleted. So you have to be straight into your recovery stuff to make sure you have the energy then to go in throughout the day. But again, it's definitely, I'd never recommend people getting up 1 or 2 hours before, if it's early in the morning, like getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning just so they can eat before they go to the gym.
Just some light options then if you are training early, like not just gym at 6 o'clock, but if you've, say, GA training at 9 o'clock in the morning, you probably can justify getting up about an hour early before that. Now 8 o'clock isn't crazy or anything. But some light
Speak
options
for
there.
yourself.
Yeah.
Just some light options there are the 0% Greek style yogurt with some granola or with some fruit. That can be very easy on the stomach and and you'll find flavors. Like some people will just have a flavor completely disagree with them once they start exercising. Others will be fine with them all. Shane there, since I met him and saw him eating the porridge and whey with water, it's been my go-to as well.
There you go.
For evening
Another
training,
convert.
yeah, for evening training, a slice of brown bread
Influencer.
and jam or a scone and jam tends to be really easy on the stomach and nice and light, and gives a decent amount of energy there as well. Other people like low-fat milk with some of the cereals we talked about earlier, the sugary cereals. We generally, I won't recommend cereals to anyone, but for performance or for exercise, they can
Won't
be
recommend again.
yeah. They can be absolutely fine or nice and light on the stomach as well before training. A slice of toast can be absolutely spot on as well.
Yeah, that I would agree with all that. Like cereal, especially for people who have a good grasp of their diet, you know, that sugary cereals can be a great little spike of energy there, but they're also quite light on your stomach, and they're easily digestible. It's fantastic. Things like I suppose my go-tos then would be maybe your banana bread with some low-fat Greek yogurt, having a slice of that. That it's filling at the time. There's a good energy source off it, but it doesn't involve you having to get up and go making something there early in the morning. It's just something that you have ready, slice it, and you know it's very quick to put together and get on board. It's even something if you do happen to cut things a little bit tighter, you can carry in the car with you and eat it as you're going there. So it's about convenience a little bit that early in the morning. But the big thing really, I think, Shane, you've nailed it there with early morning training. Leaving a couple of hours past post training before eating can be it can really slow down the recovery process. It can lead to you, even in the more immediate, it can lead to fatigue and lack of focus in your workday, which you obviously don't want. So ensuring that, right, you have all your endorphins, you have extra blood flow going around the body, so you're going to be more alert from that. But if you're not eating post training, if you're not getting in good quality protein source, good quality complex carbohydrates like your whole grains or oats or whatever it might be, that basically you do risk losing focus because we do need energy, and we do use carbohydrate or glycogen to fuel our brain. So if you do happen to follow, say, intermittent fasting type approach or windowed eating, and waiting, if you exercise early in the morning, then wait till 12, 1 in the day or 2 in the day to eat, this may have a detrimental effect on your ability to perform to your best in your work setting as well. So as well as having maybe a non-optimal recovery window. So I do think that that's a huge point for people who train or exercise early in the morning to keep in mind, that this can be a big issue that they can easily overlook. And it could be down to, as you said, just coming out of the out of your gym training and just being manic busy with work. If that's the case, then having a strategy in place, being a little bit more planned in advance, so that you don't allow that big window to open up post training is incredibly important.
Yeah, I think that probably wraps us up for today. We've discussed a few things that'll definitely set us up for future episodes there as well, between supplements and intermittent fasting that's been dropped there now as well. If people have anything they'd like us to discuss, then get in touch with any of us. You'll see our contact details below, or just drop a comment underneath the YouTube section as well. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.